In the final year of World War II, as Japan faced mounting defeats across the Pacific, the Imperial Navy turned to increasingly desperate measures. Among the most haunting was the Kaiten, a human-guided torpedo packed with explosives and steered by a lone pilot towards certain death. Conceived as a last-ditch weapon to slow the Allied advance, the Kaiten demanded not just skill, but complete sacrifice. This is the story of those young men who volunteered, trained, and ultimately died within the steel hulls of their torpedoes, not as reckless fanatics, but as products of a collapsing empire willing to spend its youth in the name of duty. Explore the dark path of a typical Kaiten pilot, from recruitment and indoctrination, through rigorous training, to a mission from which there was no return. Japan's leaders conceived the Kaiten in 1944, desperate for a miracle weapon. With Allied forces pushing closer, naval commanders resurrected earlier ideas of suicide craft. Manned suicide planes, kamikazes, had already begun, and now the Navy's engineers re-envisioned the deadly torpedo. Official development began in February 1944, and by late July, the first Kaiten prototype was complete. The Type 1 Kaiten, essentially a modified Type 93 Long Lance torpedo fitted with a tiny cockpit, became the standard model. Within months, hundreds of these human-guided torpedoes were built for the war effort. At first, the idea of a human torpedo was controversial even in Japan. Commanders debated whether victory might still be achieved by conventional means. But, as 1944 wore on and fuel, food, and ships dwindled for Japan, desperation won out. In July 1944, the Navy formally adopted the Kaiten program. In practice, roughly 330 Type 1 Kaiten were produced, and over 100 were deployed in operations. Several other Kaiten types were designed, but none saw actual combat. From the start, only volunteer or specially selected young men were sent into the torpedoes. The average Kaiten pilot was not an elite admiral or an old veteran, but an ordinary sailor in his late teens or early 20s. In fact, almost all were between 17 and 28 years old. Many had served on submarines or destroyers before being chosen. They usually stood 5 feet 5 inches, the height of the cockpit, and were physically fit enough to endure cramped quarters. Recruitment intensified as the war situation became more dire. Young sailors across Japan were screened by the Navy's elite forces, and those deemed capable were accepted into the new special attack units to carry out this final, fatal duty. Ideology and duty were hammered into these recruits from day one. The Kaiten program was steeped in the same ultranationalist propaganda that had inspired the kamikaze airmen. Officers reminded them of the samurai heritage and the imperial war code. As one Kaiten trainee later recalled, his instructors were surprisingly informal and fatherly, helping the men accept their fate. But beneath the outward calm was fierce conviction. They lived by phrases like, "Death is as light as a feather, duty as heavy as a mountain." Many wore a white hachimaki headband, embroidered with the imperial sun, and carried a short ceremonial sword or dagger, linking them to the warrior past. In a widely recorded ceremony before the first mission, a vice admiral personally handed each Kaiten pilot a sword, to be kept for victory, or to be used for ritual suicide in defeat. In the hours before departure, each man knelt at a small shrine, on his submarine, to pray, and left letters or poems for loved ones. They donned plain dark jumpsuits and their headbands. In the telling words of one post-war writer, they viewed themselves as elite even in this ultimate sacrifice. In reality, they were frightened young men trying to live up to impossible expectations. Training a Kaiten pilot was a slow, exacting grind. At a remote naval station on Otsushima Island, in Japan's inland sea, the Navy built a special training camp complete with launch ramps, test pits, and calm, shallow waters. Here the recruits learned to drive by periscope and instruments alone, simulating the blindness of underwater navigation. First, they crewed high-speed surface boats, practicing maneuvers solely by dashboard readings. Once they mastered that, they graduated to the training Kaitens, torpedoes fitted with dummy, non-explosive warheads, and a safety ballast that could blow them to surface in emergencies. Early drills were simple. Circle around a visible buoy or island at slow speed, learning the feel of steering and trim. As their skill grew, instructors introduced hazards, low-speed runs around rocky islets, or fast runs through narrow channels, both by day and under dim light. Pilots had to surface frequently to scope out the landscape, adjusting depth and ballast as their oxygen supply lightened the weight of the craft. Nighttime exercises taught them to navigate only by instruments and the faint moon above. Trim adjustments were particularly tricky. As the hydrogen peroxide fuel burned off, the Kaiten became lighter, demanding constant correction. Final exercises were performed in open ocean. The pilots rode in unarmed Kaitens, launched from a submerged mother submarine, honing attack runs on target ships at full speed, up to 40 knots. These maneuvers were deadly. Colliding with a target, even at test speed, could crumple the torpedo's bow and hurl the pilot into the water. In fact, at least 15 pilots died in training accidents. One of these was Lieutenant Hiroshi Kuroki, a co-designer of the Kaiten. As the months passed, the pilots saw that these suicide exercises were not exaggeration. Every mission would be a one-way trip. Between drills, daily life for a Kaiten pilot was tense and cramped. Most lived on their submarines or at remote barracks near the training base. The schedules were strict. Wake before dawn for inspection of the torpedoes, hours at the simulator pool, meals of rice and fish eaten silently in a mess hall. There was little to say, except in hushed tones, and each man kept a small bundle of personal items, photos of family or a letter, tucked in his uniform. Strict discipline coexisted with a strange camaraderie. They were all in this together. Psychologically, they were always hovering between fear and resolve. Officially, no amount of fear or doubt was tolerated. Surrender was taboo. They were taught from childhood that retreating was dishonorable. Still, many confided in each other that they were scared. Some tried to steel themselves by reading patriotic poetry or the writings of wartime authors who glorified sacrifice. One surviving pilot noted that instructors treated them kindly, almost parentally, perhaps to help them accept the idea of honorable death as a privilege rather than a punishment. When weeks passed without orders, tension mounted. Pilots would often stare at the stills of water through the periscope or out a boat hatch, wondering if this would be the night. Rumors flew of imminent attacks or news of other kamikaze missions far away. Some believed reaching an enemy carrier would redeem Japan. Others feared being sent to explode against a floating fuel barge. At any time, they could be told to suit up and board the Kaiten waiting for them. Inside a Kaiten, conditions were suffocating. The pilot sat in a tiny cylindrical space, barely larger than his body. The cramped compartment smelled of oil, seawater, and the pungent chemicals of the peroxide engine. Its air supply was limited. A clean air tank gave enough oxygen for only about 30 minutes. Thereafter, a primitive filter of solid sodium peroxide had to scrub the carbon dioxide. Noise was constant. The roar of the torpedo's engine, the creaks of the hull, and the heartbeat of a young man rising under stress. Each pilot understood the craft well. He had controls to start the motor, to turn the rudder, and even a lever to detonate the warhead or blow the craft's air ballast if captured. But the pilot had no way out. All early designs that had included an escape hatch were altered so the cockpit locked from the outside. In short, they were in a sealed coffin with an engine. When a Kaiten squadron finally went into action, every detail was planned for one goal: striking a worthy enemy ship. Kaiten were never launched from shore in combat, except in one late case. they were carried on the decks of special submarines. These mother subs were modified with cradles on top to hold 2, 4, or even 6 human torpedoes. In most operations, a submarine carried 4 Kaiten, each with a pilot inside. When ready, the submarine's crew would surface at night, often just miles from the target, open small hatches, and each pilot would climb through an access tube into his torpedo. The hatch behind him was sealed and locked. The crew of the sub set the internal gyroscope of each Kaiten to the rough bearing of a target ship. Then the Kaitens were rolled overboard. The sub might stay submerged for these launches, but once a Kaiten was in the water, the pilot was on his own. The torpedo's motor would begin propelling him forward. Using the little periscope and his trained instinct, the pilot navigated quietly toward the enemy anchorage or convoy. Ideally, the Kaiten surfaced only briefly when still distant, long enough to check bearings. This was the most dangerous moment, as radar or lookouts could spot a bobbing torpedo. After confirming the location, the pilot resubmerged, armed the 4-ton warhead, and headed in for the attack run at full speed. From accounts, we know they aimed for a ship's side. A well-timed crash would rupture hull and ignite fuel stores. If the Kaiten hit, the warhead exploded catastrophically. If the pilot missed at first, he could try again, but if no target appeared, his only other choice was to manually detonate the warhead and die on the spot. In essence, each pilot had surrendered the very choice of life or death. As one wartime report dryly noted, if the mission failed, he would detonate his vessel as a last resort. The very first operational use came on the night of the 20th of November 1944, near Ulithi Atoll. The Japanese sent 2 subs with 4 Kaiten each into the American anchorage. In that attack, one Kaiten, piloted by Lieutenant Sekio Nishina, fatally struck the oiler USS Mississinawa, causing a massive explosion. For a few dramatic moments, Tokyo Radio declared victory, even claiming several warships sunk. In reality, only the Mississinawa went down, and 2 other Kaiten from that attack were quickly destroyed. One rammed by a destroyer, another beached on a reef. All 3 pilots had perished. Subsequent Kaiten operations followed similarly tragic patterns. Submarines prowled off Ulithi, Guam, Okinawa, and Leyte with their precious human torpedoes. Occasionally, a Kaiten found its mark. In July 1945, one salvo sank the destroyer escort USS Underhill, killing over 100 men. In another attack, an American landing craft, LCI-600, was destroyed. But these successes came at a dire cost to the Japanese. By early 1945, it was clear the Kaiten would not turn the tide. US forces grew adept at anti-submarine warfare. They hunted and destroyed the Kaiten-carrying submarines almost as soon as they launched. In fact, many submarines were lost before their pilots could fire. For example, submarine I-37 was sunk by destroyers near the Philippines, with all 117 aboard, including 4 ready-to-launch Kaiten pilots. Another, I-370, was sunk with all 84 hands after a radar-equipped aircraft detected it. In total, historians tally 8 Japanese submarines lost on Kaiten missions, costing roughly 846 crewmen. The Kaiten pilots themselves rarely survived. Of the roughly 100 men who rode out on combat missions, only 2 are recorded to have returned alive. Overall, 106 Kaiten pilots died on operational missions. A further 15 died in training or accidents. In comparison, their weapons scored almost no targets. According to the Allies, the only definitive sinkings were the Mississinawa, Underhill, and LC-600. A few other Allied ships were damaged, but never critically. However, the total number of ships sunk by Kaitens is believed to be between 40 and 50, although the only ones of any note were the 3 mentioned. One post-war American summary flatly called the Kaiten effort a miserable failure despite the pilots' courage. Within Japan, the human toll did not go unnoticed. Even before the war ended, memorial services were quietly held. Surviving submariners spoke of the empty bunks of their Kaiten comrades. With the distance of time, historians see the Kaiten as a tragic footnote to the Pacific War. It was a weapon born of desperation, a bloody symbol of how far a nation would go to try to avert defeat. But the human story remains most vivid. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the Kaiten program had cost the lives of over 100 young pilots and the crews of 8 submarines. Its limited tactical success was clear even to Japan's naval command. Though several ships had been damaged or destroyed by Kaiten, including USS Mississauga and USS Underhill, the weapon had failed to alter the course of the war. It became one of many desperate measures taken in the final months, a symbol not of strength, but of the extent of sacrifice Japan was willing to demand of even its youngest servicemen. In the weeks that followed the surrender, the remaining Kaiten craft were scrapped. Their mother submarines surrendered to Allied forces. At Otsushima and other bases, abandoned training equipment rusted in place, a quiet testament to the rushed nature of the program and its hasty end. Surviving naval officers gave testimony about Kaiten operations during Allied interrogations, confirming what little the outside world already suspected, that these suicide weapons were not a decisive secret weapon, but the product of dwindling options. For the families of those who perished, the war's end brought little clarity. Many had been told their sons died with honor in battle, but the details were vague or withheld entirely. In some cases, the pilots' last letters arrived weeks after the surrender, delivered by naval couriers still performing their duties. Memorial services were held quietly in temples and villages, often without official recognition. Within the former Navy itself, the Kaiten units were remembered with a somber pride. Submarine crews who had launched them mourned the loss of their fellow sailors. Officers who had trained or selected the pilots offered their own accounts, most often emphasizing the volunteers' sense of duty and resolve, and rarely the politics that had driven the weapon's creation. By the late 1940s, the remnants of the Kaiten program had already faded from public attention, buried beneath the broader devastation of the war and the reconstruction that followed. But for those who had witnessed the launches, or served aboard the launch submarines, the memory remained clear. A weapon born of desperation, guided by human hands towards certain death. In the end, these young pilots achieved neither a decisive victory nor even survival, but they left behind a haunting legacy of duty and loss that history will not soon erase.